Adrienne Bush is joining us tonight. She has agreed to speak with us about housing in Kentucky. It's a lot more than that. She earned her master's in public administration, and since 2017, she has served as executive director of the Homelessand Housing Coalition of Kentucky in Frankfort, which values housing as a human right and affirms that housing solves homelessness. At HEC, she is responsible for day-to-day organizational management, leading advocacy efforts, and overseeing program staff. Her current role at HEC comes after 15 years of direct service provision in the homeless, housing, and early childhood education fields in Hazard and Perry County, and having served on HEC's board of directors from 2006 to 2015. She lives in Frankfort with her family. So we do definitely welcome you. You can see the people online. Many of us are involved, all of us are involved in justice in some way. And so we've done all kinds of things. So the folks online, John's going to do the recording. Steve is going to lead us into the justice devotional moment. And Kurt's right there with the wonderful headphones. And Patricia and Kenny are the face, you don't see them, but they're very active. So let's go around the room. You want to start over there with the woman in the yellow?
Who is it? I'm Liz. What else do you want to know?
That's it.
Okay.
Oh. I'm Vicki. Are you going to be at the Kentucky Movement this weekend as your group?
I actually, no, we are not. But I'm glad to hear that it sounds like you will be.
Yeah.
So that's great.
I had to know.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Margetta McFarland, and I have heard you before on a build meeting, a research meeting we did 2 or 3 years ago.
That's right.
So I'm looking forward to this too.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul Jones. Ken.
I'm Julian.
Cheryl Bashbinder.
Okay.
And Connie Hubbard. We got to talk on the phone, and that was really nice to get to know you a little
It
bit.
was a good break in my day, so I appreciated it.
Well, Steve is going to say a little bit, and then you've got the floor.
Okay. Sounds good.
You got it, Steve.
Okay, last week I asked you to hear that we are invited by God to seek and to work for economic justice. This week, I'd like for us to hear the voices of those who are limited or crippled or oppressed or victimized or stymied by our unjust economic system. Or maybe better said, our unjust way of conducting our economic system. And as we think about those voices, I hope we can hear an understanding of economic justice, particularly the 3 principles of economic justice that are defined in an article by Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler. These are 3 interdependent and absolutely essential principles, they say. Participative justice, distributive justice, and social justice, like the 3 legs of a 3-legged stool. They all have to be there, and they all have to be working in order for that economic justice stool to be able to stand. Putting those 3 things in a different way, people deserve the right to earn a decent living. People deserve the right to contribute to our society and to our economic system. And people deserve the right for representative seating at the table where decisions are made. It is, I believe, our concern, our prayer, our responsibility to work towards the establishment of these 3 legs of the stool of economic justice. Tonight and into the future, may we hear the voices of those who are crying out to us for help. Connie.
Thank you, Steve. All right, you have it.
Okay. Well, thank you for providing that setting. I think it's very appropriate for the topic that we have at hand tonight. So a little bit about the Homelessand Housing Coalition of Kentucky. We are a statewide organization. We were started in 1987. We have kind of a unique perspective on administering housing assistance to people experiencing homelessness. We do have some direct rental assistance that we provide in counties outside of Fayette County. Our mission is to eliminate the threat of homelessness and fulfill the promise of affordable housing. And we also convene and staff the Kentucky Interagency Council on Homelessness. This is a statewide planning body that is authorized by Kentucky statute to be a resource in terms of what works and what doesn't in homeless policy for the General Assembly and the general public. So, and I'm going to start off with just some level setting on kind of where we are in the housing landscape. So nationally, we know that 1 in 4 families who qualify for housing assistance actually get it. So imagine who is familiar with playing musical chairs. You probably haven't done it recently, but like you might have done it, you know, when you were a kid, or when you were raising your own kids. But imagine if we had 50 people in this room, and I don't know how many chairs there are, but there are not 50 here, right?
No.
And so if I am running late, as I was, and also I had like broken my leg before I got here, and like I was late because I was at the emergency room, as opposed to I was late because I packed too much into my day today. I would come in and there would not be a chair for me, right? There just were not enough chairs. But if you ask me, Adrienne, why are you chairless? I would say, because I broke my leg and I'm running late. But that doesn't really get to the fundamental of there are not enough chairs. And that is how mainstream housing assistance in our country is funded. It is not funded as an entitlement or something that everybody who would otherwise qualify for it gets. Unlike some other programs, like I'm thinking Medicaid, theoretically SNAP, Social Security, disability. Not that there aren't any issues with those programs and people not being able to access those benefits, but they at least aren't like completely turned away at the door. Full stop. So in this country, with the federal budget, we just don't fund housing assistance on the mandatory side of the budget. We also don't fund homeless assistance either, that is targeted to people who are without a home. It is very restricted, competitive funding going across the country, which I'll talk more about later. Housing is both viewed as shelter, and I think those of us who were raised in the Christian tradition, Protestant especially, like we view it as shelter, right? It is also viewed as a wealth building instrument, especially if you have the ability to purchase a home, live in it, build equity, pass it on to your kids, or even, you know, sell it, make a profit, buy another house. And I'm not saying, I'm not making a judgment on that, but it does complicate things when you are talking about sheltering. If the primary source of sheltering someone, housing, is viewed as a wealth building instrument, and therefore it is more scarce, it's more of a scarce commodity, there's a scarcity mentality around it. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that reality that we all live in. From the time that the Department of Housing and Urban Development was created officially as a cabinet level agency in the 1960s, I mean, less than 5 years later, Congress was already like having second thoughts and kind of defunding it, stagnating the funding. It's never quite matched the actual need. that is present in the country. At the community level and at the individual level, there's a severe mismatch between housing costs and income. We've had some welcome upward pressure on wages, but housing costs are still outstripping what people are earning, particularly in the service sector, right? We do have some complicating policies around mental illness and incarceration, and those systems can kind of feed into, we call them feeder systems, and so that's some of the policies that happen in those institutions then produce homelessness. And then long-standing patterns of race and class segregation that just have to be dismantled. So all of those things are like this big cloud, right? That we're all just, or sea that we're all kind of just swimming in. And what that results in statewide is that about 4,000 Kentuckians experience homelessness on a given night in January every year. It results in a shortage of 89,000 affordable homes to rent for extremely low income Kentuckians. The average wage to affordably rent a 2-bedroom home where you're not like having to struggle to make the rent every single month is $17.90 per hour. That's the statewide average. So it's lower in some areas, higher than others. 1 in 4 Kentuckians are paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And 30% is the generally accepted point at which economists have said, like, that's where your housing is affordable. You should be spending no more than 30% on either your mortgage and utilities or your rent and utilities. Those 1 in 4 Kentuckians, they include those who do have a mortgage, and then that is more dire for extremely low income renters because 6 out of 10 of those folks are paying more than 50%, not more than 30%, more than 50%. And then also in Kentucky and nationwide, but from a statewide perspective, we continue to have a significant gap in who owns a home in the state and who rents. And we have 38.2% Black home ownership rate in the context of an overall 72.5% state home ownership rate. And so that's that if there is that big of a gap, then if you are renting, like, there is a disproportionate number of folks who are Black and brown who are renting and who are disproportionately affected by the constraints in our housing market. So I mentioned with the musical chairs and analogy, you have the fundamental problem of there not being enough chairs or enough houses, enough homes. That is not to say that there aren't additional complicating policy considerations that kind of affect homelessness in particular. And one is criminal justice system involvement. People who have been incarcerated more than once are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general public. Public housing authority practices. With the creation of public housing authorities, we have a lot of PHAs or housing authorities across Kentucky. Of course, we're in Lexington, you all have yours. And some are large and sophisticated and others are not. And it's just very fragmented. And in the 1990s, there was a significant push during the Clinton administration to clean up public housing and implement 3 strikes rules and really bar anyone who had ever been convicted of anything or charged with anything from accessing public housing. And again, going back to like who rents in this country, who is charged with criminal justice system involvement, that has a severely disproportionate impact on Black and brown Kentuckians, right? it also begs the question, what are public housing authorities for, if not to house people? But that's just my personal opinion, so. Using homeownership as a wealth building tool. Again, just acknowledging what we're, what our factors are. And then both racialized and rural appraisal gaps. Connie mentioned I lived in Perry County. There were significant appraisal gaps from Hazard to out in the county, or even Hazard to, say, Lexington. Sometimes what it costs to build in our rural areas, the houses won't appraise for that, or the apartment complexes won't appraise for that, and so that makes it difficult to build. Okay, so I'm going to touch on homeownership needs, because it does because so many of us in Kentucky are considered homeowners, it does impact the larger housing climate. And one of the things, one of the conditions that we have is an overaging housing stock. We have not kept pace, even before the Great Recession, our builders have not kept pace with the demand for housing. And it got worse after the Great Recession and the housing crash. People are a little nervous about building. It is more expensive to build, and it does require because we have an aging housing stock. It's like we have to keep every house we have, but also we have to keep building. But we have to figure out ways to preserve the housing that we have. There are federal programs that are used, and that includes money that comes to Lexington Fayette Urban County government, like the Home Investment Partnerships Program, Community Development Block Grant funding, and so on and so forth. We do have a state affordable housing trust fund that is funded through the deed transfer fee. Every time a piece of real estate is sold, there is a $6 fee that shows up very deep in your closing costs that goes to the county clerk. And the county clerk then turns around and remits it to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is housed at Kentucky Housing Corporation. It has helped build a lot of affordable housing, both rental and homes, single family homes over the last 20 years. But because it is just that flat $6 fee, it's really dependent on the volume of transactions and not like the value. It's not indexed to anything. Yeah, and so it generally will generate about $3 to $6 million annually, which again is really nice, and we don't want it to go away. But it also needs to it's not going to meet the demand on its own. When COVID hit, there was lots of pandemic relief that was passed over a couple of years. One thing that I do try to share with folks, it may be helpful, it may not, but there was a homeowner assistance fund that was created, and it is being administered by Kentucky Housing Corporation. The state got $85 million to help people who were delinquent on their mortgages. It's still going. It was passed as part of the American Rescue Plan Act in March of 21, and it can go until 2025 or whenever funds are expended first. So comparing it to the emergency rental assistance program, we got a lot of emergency rental assistance, probably about $250, $280 million total in the state. It's basically done. And so and the homeowner assistance fund is like a quarter obligated. So that's how we know the folks who were most impacted by the COVID, the public health emergency, and who were in dire straits before. But this program is still available, so it is at protectmykentuckyhome.org. And I'm just telling people, go and get your money, please, if you qualify, if you were impacted by COVID in any way, which we all were. So, okay. So I tend to talk about homeless and rental assistance.
I'm sorry, what was that? Protectmykentuckyhome.org?
.org. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks. Sorry.
I tend to talk about homeless and rental assistance together because they impact each other so much. And really what we have found in modern history, last 50 years, particularly since the 80s, 90s, 2000s, is what is driving unsheltered homelessness and housing insecurity is unaffordable rents. At the community level, if you compare city to city, any statistically significant increase in median rent can be, you're going to see an effect of an additional 9% of unsheltered homelessness. Now, it's really dire. You see this a lot on the coast, New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles, but we're not immune to it in Kentucky. And so the folks who are at the bottom of the income spectrum, those folks that we call that like are in what we call 0 to 30% area median income. And these are your folks who are working at your gas stations. They're working in your child cares. They are the CNAs at the hospital. They are the ones who are in that really low income range. At the top of like the renting market, people who are at like 80% of AMI, those are your teachers, your police, your firefighters, more, you could say like office workers, whatever. They are also being like priced out of home ownership. Because of the scarcity in the single family side and the rental side, like I'm sure some of you may even be dealing with it with kids in their 20s who you may have been able to afford a house at that time, but they are being squeezed out and being told, well, no, you have too much debt or you don't have enough income for an $1,000 mortgage, but sure, you can keep paying $1,500 a month in rent. Like, it's very frustrating on both sides of the income range. In Lexington, we have seen a lot of coverage about rising housing costs, particularly in the rental market, in the Herald Leader, on WKYT, that sort of thing. We are definitely seeing it statewide, but Lexington, Louisville, and Northern Kentucky are like the on fire spots, if you will. So talking about homelessness, I mentioned that about 4,000 Kentuckians experience homelessness at a given point in time in January annually. This is measured by what we call the point in time count. And every year it happens about the same time. The idea is to count people who are literally unsheltered or in a shelter or attempting to flee domestic violence. It does not count people who are couch surfing or doubled up. So there's some criticism that it doesn't always capture everybody who is experiencing housing insecurity writ large, right? But again, this goes back to what I talked about at the top, which is we have not funded housing assistance. Therefore, every single budget year, it is a fight. And HUD is charged with basically triaging, trying to house the most vulnerable and deciding who the most vulnerable people are. You look like you have a question. You don't,
No,
you're just thinking.
I'm listening.
Okay, so.
Can I pop a question?
Yes.
The increase.
Have questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I never ask questions, but the increase in the rental market and rental costs, is there a way to kind of guess at how much of that is driven by corporations, out-of-state corporations buying up housing as an investment that really don't give a rat's tail about the people living in the apartments, they're just, yeah, that's, I'm giving my bias here, but
It is sometimes the ownership in a rental market in a given community can feel a little bit like a black box. Nationally, the private equity stakeholder project has done a good job trying to track down what corporations are consolidating in the rental market, who is hiding under what LLC these days. But it can be tricky. And it's a good research question. My biased answer is going to be too many of them, is what it feels like to me from people, as someone who answers your phone every day from people in distress. Okay, you're welcome. So generally, homelessness unsheltered has declined over the past 10 years. It had been declining. Let me clarify that. It hit kind of a low point during the height of the pandemic in 2021, mostly because it was just a sheltered count at that point due to safety precautions. It is starting to rise, and it's not just starting to rise in Lexington. Louisville is reported an increase in what we call the balance of state. The rest of the other 118 counties also reported an increase this January. It's not perfect. There are a lot of criticisms about the point in time count tool. But what I think is helpful is when you look at it year over year for trend analysis and to see, are the numbers generally going up or down? As well as I do like a little pie chart to show this is not just a Lexington problem. This is not just a Louisville problem. This is, we have people experiencing homelessness across the state. Over half the folks are in the other 118 counties. Louisville has about 30%. Lexington has about 18% of the total count. The other thing we look at too is where service providers are. Theoretically, if you have more service providers that are providing actual permanent housing, your homeless numbers are going to decrease, right? That's the idea. And in places like Lexington, we had a professor at UK. He defected to Florida. I won't name any names. But while he was here, he did some research around changes in Kentucky homeless service providers and unsheltered homelessness. And from 2015 to 2021, Fayette County was one of the bright spots in as they increased providers targeted to people, the different populations experiencing homelessness, unsheltered homelessness was going down. That's what we want to see happen. However, in Kentucky, we have a lot of service deserts, a lot of places where there are no even shelters at all, let alone actual housing. The other thing too that we look at is what we call coordinated entry or common assessment. So in Lexington, you have the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention. They are charged with making sure that everybody who is street or sheltered homeless receives a common assessment to be placed on what we call a prioritization list. Again, because we're dealing with scarcity mindset, we're going to try to prioritize the permanent housing resources. What we found in 2020 was that we had about 4,100 entries across the state, which actually tells me that our point in time count number isn't that off. We also look at Office of Health Data Analytics within the Cabinet for Health and Family Services to look at hospital discharge data, because we know that's an issue across the state, also here in Lexington. And there in 2020, we had about, or 2019, I think, about 4,100 individuals. So, where do people go who are experiencing homelessness when we rehouse them? Generally the rental market. So we talk about statewide rental need. I mentioned at the top that we have a deficit of 90,000 affordable units across the state. And that number comes from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They look at it state by state, even by congressional district. And so statewide, we know for that extremely low income population, if they were to be stably housed in housing that they could afford, we would need to have like 90,000 units right now. I mentioned also the statewide housing wage. And again, really glad for the upward pressure on wages. Keep it coming. But it is like wages have gone up and rents are going like this.
Right.
So.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea the number of children in this? I mean, are the 4,000 including children?
It does include
Okay. children.
I don't have off the top of my head, I'm thinking more in aggregate numbers. Because it is a street or sheltered count, it's going to have fewer children. I mean, when I want to look at like child homelessness or youth homelessness, I also look at the Kentucky Department of Education numbers.
Okay.
Because they too are required to do a homeless count at the beginning of the year, by grade, by school, by district. The difference is they're working with a different federal definition. They're working with a broader one that includes couch surfing and like economically distressed, like I'm getting evicted all the time. And so the numbers are a lot broader. It's ranged like since I've been working and paying attention to that particular metric over the last 5-10 years, it's ranged between like 20 and 28,000 children. So keep in mind, yeah, it's a broader definition, so the number is going to be larger, but in terms of like if we think broadly about housing insecurity, it's very accurate. So okay, so some of the federal resources that do come into communities like Lexington are Continuum of Care, Emergency Solutions Grant. Again, your Continuum of Care is housed at the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention at LFUCG. Some cities do it differently, like in Louisville, the city gets the ESG money, but the Coalition for the Homeless, which is a nonprofit organization, gets the COC money. At the state level, Kentucky Housing Corporation is the COC and the ESG grantee. So, but some newer resources we do have, I mentioned at the beginning, you know, people who, if we're talking about like the Housing Choice Voucher Program or public housing, 1 in 4 families nationwide actually get it. We do have more vouchers in Kentucky than we have ever had before. We're nowhere near the number of vouchers that we need, but thanks to the American Rescue Plan Act, we do have emergency housing vouchers that are run through the Continuum of Care and the Housing Authority jointly. And then there's also additional mainstream housing choice vouchers. So for the first time, like we do, people who are working in housing programs are like we're not just dealing with wait lists that are closed 5 years on end and not accepting any new applications. Right now with the shortage and the increasing rents, I mean, the problem now, of course, is I have a voucher and I can't use it. I can't get a landlord to take it. I can't find a rent that is low enough to meet it. But I will say we have at least, before the problem was you just didn't even have a voucher. Like that wasn't even an option. So we're working towards solutions there. Okay, so Connie had asked me to talk, that was a lot of level setting. I appreciate your indulgence. But Connie had asked me to talk about current conditions. I do find that level setting is helpful in understanding where we are today, which is why I do it. So, and to talk about policies that harm or help. And I will say, one of the things that at the macro level is a policy that harms is, and that is very current right now, is federal funding uncertainty. As Congress finally is returning from its August recess, we don't have a budget for the year that starts in 3 weeks.
1st of October.
Yeah.
1st of October.
And so, and that part of the issue is, there was the debt ceiling agreement in May, and then, but there isn't real true agreement on the top line numbers, which is why, like, the Senate has done all of the appropriations work on their side, but the House has not. Like, they have done, they've done markups, they have done bills, the House has tried to insert deep cuts to certain safety net programs. No one's agreeing on the top line figures. And so what now happens theoretically is a continuing resolution, maybe a shutdown. But I will say, if you ask somebody who is literally experiencing homelessness, like outside, and they probably would not say that the government shutting down is their biggest priority, like whatever. They've got bigger fish to fry, they're trying to survive. But from a housing landscape, just a government that cannot provide its basic function, like constitutional obligation, and is always lurching from crisis to crisis, makes it very hard to address housing insecurity and homelessness in a sane way, if that makes sense. So one of the solutions, obviously, is to just fund the government. Now, I realize I'm preaching to the literal choir here, but I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves of that. I have a slide deck. I never used to be a PowerPoint person. I'm a PowerPoint person. I think it was a pandemic development, but it helps me organize my thoughts. Connie, I am happy to send this to you, not because people want to watch a PowerPoint presentation, but because there may be helpful links, including like sign-ons and stuff like that.
If you want to, that'd be great.
Okay, I will do that. Okay. On the policy side, aside from the funding side, one of the policies that we see that deeply harms Kentuckians can be grouped under what I call anti-housing first. And I'm going to start by describing something by describing what it isn't. So just bear with me. Currently, HUD prioritizes a housing first approach in programming and funding to agencies solving homelessness and housing people. And they do this in their awarding of housing grants on an annual basis. And they do this because Congress, in its authorizing legislation over the years, has told HUD, hey, we don't want to throw good money after bad. You need to fund evidence-based interventions. Okay. From the anti-housing first camp, we hear a lot of, well, housing first doesn't work because it's housing only. And what we have observed and read the research and done the practice ourselves is that true high fidelity housing first programs promote stable housing first with wraparound services. It's not housing only. And the reason I'm talking about this is because Congressman Barr has introduced a bill that's called Housing Plus, the Housing Plus Act in this Congress. And Housing Plus sounds great because Housing Plus, that sounds very positive, right? This bill would require HUD to dilute its homelessness funding, which isn't very much. Lexington's, the amount of homeless funding Lexington gets is $2 million a year among how many providers? It's not very much. It would require HUD to include programs that provide only temporary accommodations for compliant recovery participants. Because from that perspective, the idea is, well, housing costs are not what is driving homelessness. We have put more money from the federal government into housing over the years, which is true. Homelessness funding has increased. Has it increased to meet the need? No, it is not, but it has increased. But we're going to ignore the ongoing rent hikes and just blame providers and people who are experiencing homelessness and say that it's primarily because of their mental illness or primarily because of their substance use. And again, going back to the musical chairs metaphor, like if there were never enough chairs to begin with, yes, there is some overlap statistically between mental illness, behavioral health, substance use, substance abuse, and homelessness. But it's not everyone. Not everyone experiencing homelessness is mentally ill. Not everyone who is mentally ill is experiencing homelessness. Most drug users are actually using alcohol in their homes at night. And a lot of the coping mechanisms kind of play out that way if you are unsheltered. I have never been unsheltered in my life. There go, by the grace of God go I. But I don't know how I would cope. And I think if we were doing this work, we need to approach people with a deep sense of empathy and curiosity as opposed to judgment. So,
I want to say something. I don't want to. One of the things that we know, those of us working in mental health, is that the recovery rate, the ability to maintain and to do better in their recovery with mental illness and substance abuse is if they have safe housing.
yeah.
That's huge. So we want to blame the one, but we also know those that are homeless have a harder time making it than if they have a place and have some stability.
Right.
So we're really looking at this in a real cockeyed way.
No argument from me. I want to point out, a recovery housing program that is also through HUD is already available and is being deployed in Kentucky. It was authorized as part of the Supports for Communities and Patients Act, which is it's up for reauthorization this year. And it was actually from this program originates from Representative Barr's legislation from 2018 that he talked about, the Career Act. So there is already money going specifically to recovery, which is great. I don't want to leave you all with the impression that I am anti-recovery and everybody should just be high all the time. Like, no, I think recovery has its place. I think that evidence-based strategies should be used in both fields, and we just shouldn't conflate the two. The anti-housing first bills approach has already been tried in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, before the federal government started looking at housing first as the intervention that they wanted people to use based on the evidence. It has been assigned in the House Financial Services Committee, which is where Congressman Barr sits, but it has not yet been heard. So, and I just want to say, we should fund evidence-based recovery programming, but not with the limited amount of permanent housing money Congress appropriates.
So if I'm going to write a letter to Representative Barr, what would you recommend go in that letter?
Tell him Adrienne Bush. No, I'm just kidding. I think you can talk about, excuse me.
This is assuming that you would actually, someone would read it. That
I will, and to give credit where credit is due, he is very clearly very interested in this issue of the intersection of substance use, behavioral health, and homelessness. And I think I mean, what frustrates me is, like, I think at the high level, like, we can agree, we all want safe communities. We don't want rampant drug abuse in the streets and like around children or anything like that. We do differ on how to get there, for sure. I think, and one of my biggest frustrations with him was when he unveiled this legislation in the last Congress, he called housing first provider-oriented providers morally bankrupt. And that just really, I was like, okay, I'm your constituent, because I was at that time. Frankfurt was still part of the 6th district. And like, I don't impugn those, I don't assign motives to him like that. So I guess if I were writing a letter and I were not the morally bankrupt Adrienne Bush that he is well aware of and does not care for, I would just say, like, in my role as your constituent, I want HUD to fund evidence-based programs, or I want to see the federal government support. You don't even have to be specific. Like, you can just say, like, I support the housing first approach. I'm still your constituent, you know? I will say too, as someone who was running an emergency and a transitional shelter in Perry County as the federal government was making that switch, it just felt like the more humane thing to do. And so I have gone through the switch myself. I actually have provided housing assistance to folks in this situation. Congressman Barr has a lot of expertise on things that I do not. I have a lot of expertise on things that he does not. From the federal level to the state and local levels, we are seeing some criminalization trends, also rooted in like anti-housing first assumptions and mental models. They're coming closer to home, and it's something I'm very worried about from a policy perspective, but also as a Kentuckian. Like, I believe in the human dignity of everyone here, and I don't want to see people suffer unneedlessly, even more than they already are. So nationally, there is new cut and paste legislation that's kind of been making its way through Missouri, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, and it has the following elements. It's passed in those first 3 states. In Georgia so far, they've been able to fend it off. But basically it would be a statewide camping ban with penalties of up to $5,000 and 1 month in jail for violations, and funding penalties to any jurisdiction that would refuse to enforce the camping ban. So a diversion of all federal and state funding for homeless services away from housing first oriented programming, and redirecting that funding to state-run encampments and shelters, basically internment camps for people experiencing homelessness, penalizing people for not going into these camps, lowering of the due process protections to involuntarily commit people. We're hearing a lot of, well, there are people who just don't want, they just don't want help. Like, there's nothing you can do for them. I will say from my experience that there may be valid reasons why people don't go into shelter. One may be household composition. In Frankfurt, my family, my very like nuclear family, my husband, me, my kid, my 14-year-old, there would not be a shelter that could accommodate our family if we were to lose our housing tomorrow. In Louisville, they literally just don't have enough shelter beds. So it's not even just a rational choice to like stay outside. It's like that their shelter beds close at 1 o'clock every afternoon because they run out. So Basically, another element would be a creation of a homeless outreach team that would be funded by homelessness dollars that would require law enforcement to force unhoused people into these encampments. That is very frustrating because here in Lexington, I think Lexington has done a good job of like trying to work with police force, for community safety. They have done a lot of work with like actual teams going out to encampments, with social workers being part of the teams. And it's not anything like this. This is, I don't know what this is, but it's not good. In Louisville over the summer, and basically since Mayor Greenberg took office, they have swept more encampments there than they had like in the prior 4 years. Like it's insane. They are up to so many sweeps of encampments. And the problem is like, I feel like it's very inhumane. As a Christian, like I have a real hard time with it from that perspective. But I am also a pragmatist, and I can tell you, like, it just doesn't work. Even if, like, you set aside the inhumanity of it, whatever, it just doesn't work. You sweep an encampment one day, if you don't actually have, like, a housing voucher and a unit ready to go in hand, like, people still have to find another place to sleep. They're going to go elsewhere. And so all you've done is just shuffle them around. They've probably lost their belongings. Because, you know, your public works people put them in the trash. They probably lost their ID, which will be hard if they're trying to drive to get to work or apply for housing or anything like that. So it's backwards. So one solution, I talked about housing first. It's a housing first program. Like there is no like one size fits all. It is very client driven, and all it is we're just going to prioritize the first intervention as housing. Not that there won't be other interventions, but the first one's going to be housing. Another important but temporary solution is just ensure that communities have shelter beds that people want to go into. That they are housing focused, that they are connected to the community, to the continuum of care. One of my big frustrations is, especially when shelters are dealing with, you know, limited funding and all of that, they may have just an arbitrary, well, you can stay here for 7 days. I'm not talking about shelters in Lexington. All your shelters are great. But I hear that and I'm like, okay, well, if somebody landed in a homeless situation, the chances that they're just going to be able to like self-resolve in 7 days, like it just, because you've hit rock bottom at that point, you know? So that seems silly, but I also understand it. Running a shelter is expensive. People, you know, there's a lot of talk about like the cost of childcare and why is childcare so expensive. And part of that is just the staffing. You have to have low staffing ratios, and you're operating like with childcare centers, you're operating from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Your average school day is, you know, 7:30 to 2:30 or whatever, 8 to 3. And you've got higher ratios. Very similar dynamics in a shelter, especially one that's trying to operate 24/7 instead of just a day or a night shelter. It's just, even if you're paying people like the minimum wage of $7.25, it's just expensive. But shelters should be low barrier. People should be screening folks in, not out on requirements. I get real frustrated when I hear like people have to have an ID in order to even enter shelter. No, if someone has lost their ID, like your job as the provider is to help them access it, like get it back. Also, I get frustrated when providers screen out based on criminal justice involvement. I get it, because I have run a shelter. You're trying to balance the safety of the whole with the rights of the individual. Not saying don't screen at all for like violent activity and stuff like that, but just a routine criminal background screening and you had a check hiding from 5 years ago or whatever, like, no. And then the other thing too is, and this goes back to anti-housing first, criminalization efforts, like communities, cities, counties, states should not try to fund one at the expense of the other. You need a functioning crisis response system. People don't actually have to go into shelter in order to get housing. Everyone is really housing ready because at some point they lost their housing. But in terms of it, I do want to acknowledge seeing unsheltered homelessness, especially when unsheltered homelessness is on the rise, like it is uncomfortable. It's most uncomfortable for the person experiencing it, but for anybody with any sort of heart, like it's difficult, it's tough to watch. I remember the first time I went to DC, like in 2017, and I hadn't been there since like 2008. And it was tough to see, and it still is. Another solution is to just prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place. I'm just full of wisdom over here. One of the things with one of the silver linings of the pandemic that I mentioned earlier was an emergency rental assistance program. And for the first time, normally if you show up to court, you didn't pay because you didn't have the money, it's a 2-second judge decision. You're done. There's no legal excuse for not paying your rent or anything like that. For the first time, judges actually had like an option, because judges don't like evictions either. Like nobody is happy with this. And so we finally had, for those, who were affected by COVID, they were able to get back rent and like 3 months future rent. And in Lexington, that program is still going. They've had to kind of means test it more to try to stretch it out a little bit longer. But they did a really good job of getting the money out the door. So much so that like the state ended up providing additional assistance on top of what Lexington got on its own. And then from our perspective, like Lexington's unique solutions and complicating factors, kind of a mixed bag. You've got the Lexington Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Connie had mentioned you all have participated with BUILD in years past and probably will continue to do so. Yeah. Love that, keep doing it. I remember watching when the Affordable Housing Trust Fund was created in Lexington, like back in the 2000s, and then it just wasn't funded, and it wasn't funded, and it wasn't funded. And I was like, gosh, sitting there for my perch in Perry County, why can't Lexington get it together? I'm just kidding. Mm-hmm. But it was a really great thing to see in the last administration and the current administration, a real effort to try to build and support more affordable housing development. You've got the housing advocates that are placed within LFUCG, a commissioner level housing commissioner, if you will, that shows the importance of it. Too often I have to have conversations with cities where they're like, well, we just don't have a housing problem, or everybody just comes here, that's our problem. And I'm like, no. And I will say too, going back to emergency rental assistance, LFUCG has put aside money to do right to counsel for tenants coming out of the pandemic, so that when they are in court, because generally speaking, about 83% of landlords have an attorney. In fact, there's a state Supreme Court opinion basically telling landlords, quit trying to represent yourselves, get an attorney. And then tenants, like if you didn't have the money for the rent, do you really have the money to pay an attorney? Like they want a retainer, right? And then legal aid is just, they've had more resources over the past few years than they've had in a very, very long time, and it's been very welcome, but they were kind of in a triage space too, where like, anyway. So that is very exciting, and something I do want to highlight. And then, of course, you've got the complicating factor of the urban service boundary debate. And as someone who lives in Franklin County, I'm not even trying to tell you what or how to think about it. I am glad that you all are having the conversations. But yeah, it's tricky. So I've got some fundamental solutions that we advocate for on the federal and the state level. One, they basically fall into 3 buckets. One is access to deeply affordable housing for extremely poor Kentuckians. Increasing housing supply to actually match current and future demand. Fayette County, Scott County keeps growing. And so that is one thing I am concerned about. And it really didn't hit me until the electric battery plant announcements, like all up and down the I-65 corridor. And I was like, oh my gosh, where are people going to live? I'm not so worried about people coming in to the Ford plant. I am worried about the people who were living at the margins before all of this economic development activity came in. And then lastly, modernize our antiquated landlord-tenant laws. So one of the things that has been under discussion in Lexington that we have been glad to see is the concept of a tenant's bill of rights. And even if a complete tenant's bill of rights does not pass, it sounds like certain elements of it at least will. So I have done a lot of talking, and I am happy to answer any questions or listen to any comments people have.
General question about demographics of the homeless. Everything from age to race to gender to economic insecurity to substance. How do you parse that out?
Sure. So looking at both the point in time count data as well as what I call the common assessment or coordinated entry, what we found was that about 25% of the homeless population in those categories were identified as African American or Black. And
What's the
as
percentage again? I didn't catch it.
25%. And we know from the last census that only 8% of Kentuckians identify as Black. So that tells you that African Americans, Black Kentuckians are significantly overrepresented. Generally speaking, I can't give you a percentage off the top of my head, sorry. It was the 1 in 4 that just stuck with me. But generally speaking, you're more likely to be a man, identify as male. Nationally, folks are getting older. That has not, the median age of someone experiencing homelessness is going up. That I've talked to Jeff Herron here in Lexington. He said that data, that trend is not holding true in Lexington. That the median age is not necessarily going up, but it's certainly not, it's not getting any younger.
Jenny Ramsey at Catholic Action would probably disagree with you on that. She
Would
spoke
she?
recently about getting older couples in there that they've not had before.
Well, I'm glad you said that. So as part of my role at the Kentucky Interagency Council, because I had someone in Northern Kentucky call me and she was like, Adrienne, I swear to God, everybody's getting older. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna bring it up at Kitch because we have Lexington there, we've got Louisville there, we've got the Kentucky Housing Corporation there. Well, on that day, Kentucky Housing wasn't there, so I couldn't ask them. Louisville and Lexington both said, because they had national support or reporters reach out to them about the trend, and Louisville said that they were not seeing that. Jeff said that they were not seeing it. But I have not, but what they did say, what they were seeing were still kind of middle-aged, 40s, 50s, but people are sicker, that they are definitely seeing more complicating illnesses. But I also, I think we need to do some more research on it. So it's helpful to have that data point from Jenny
She
via
would be a
you.
great resource.
Yeah.
She has started something called, you were there, weren't you?
Yeah.
Street Voice Council.
I read about that.
And they're gonna be meeting here monthly,
Good.
once a month. And
Do other folks know about that?
I don't, we can talk about that, actually.
Yeah, I think you should.
Kurt and I went to the last meeting. They're not able to meet here every month because there was something in November and because they were meeting on the first Wednesday. And so there was,
Thursday.
Their first Thursday. And there was something in November here and something in December here that we could not. So they do not have a permanent home.
Okay.
But what it was, I don't know, there were maybe 30 people came in, Kurt? Something like that?
Yeah, at least, yeah, probably more.
But, you're talking about age, we were listening and talking about, families. Young couple were one of the ones who were doing some of the talking. And she's epileptic, and so she has seizures all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And her, she needs to stay with her husband, but there is no place, there is no shelter in this town.
Right.
Mhm.
Where they can be together.
Right.
And they're talking about what the city's doing this year, hopefully, if they can find a place to put them, because they put homeless people in motels last year using COVID money.
Right.
They put them in hotels. This year, they have that COVID money's run out, so they're going to get some FEMA trailers, and they're going to house people there.
Yeah.
For the season, from November till the end of March, for the coldest of the seasons again.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but having those voices of the people who are actually concerned with it was a powerful thing to hear.
Yeah.
The people who are living it.
Yes.
I mean, I can picture what they're going through.
Right.
They
But it's
don't have to
different.
picture it. They are there.
Yeah.
And so it was a meaningful meeting, wasn't it, Kurt?
Yeah, it was. You had the family situation. You had a couple people complain they couldn't be with their girlfriend. It's the same thing. Several people were talking about being separated from the children. Now they're trying to expand for mothers and children. They're trying to expand the capacity at Salvation Army.
Right.
But it's still a big gap, and the kids end up in foster care. One of the families
Sent two
was-
children away, hadn't they, Kurt?
Pardon?
One of the families had sent two children away to somewhere
Yeah.
else because they couldn't, they couldn't keep them
Right.
together.
Right.
Yeah, there was another woman that also had her children removed.
Mm-hmm.
She was a bit more boisterous, so there may be another factor that the one was simply a matter of homelessness. Yeah.
So,
But
they're working at it, but it's an amazing problem because there were a lot of younger people there.
Mhm.
When you're talking about younger,
Yeah.
there were a lot of it's hard to tell the age of people. I mean,
I know. The older I get, I have a harder time telling.
I can test. I couldn't tell you
Yeah.
how the difference between them.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a meaningful kind of a thing, and I hope we can continue to do that as a church.
we had a guy when we used to do a room in the inn, and until COVID hit, but we had a guy called Pappy, I think, and he was with us, and I think his wife was maybe Salvation Army, if anywhere.
Right.
But it was a hard situation for them to cope with.
Yeah. I do think, you mentioned like they were able to do non-congregate, what we call non-congregate shelter,
Right.
with extra COVID money that has dried up. And that is a shame because I think the pandemic kind of forced us to reset and reassess like what actually is a rational decision
Right.
for folks. And like, I think moving forward, federal agencies like HUD want communities to try to expand their non-congregate shelter options.
Right.
But again, like, where's the money?
Right. Yep.
In a congregate shelter, the staffing is the big issue, but
Right.
like a non-congregate shelter, you also do want some staffing theoretically, some service. You want it to be services enriched. So it doesn't come free either,
Right.
is what I'm saying.
I want to just give a shout out for people from Central who've been involved in the Affordable Housing Trust Funds. I think it was 2005, I was headed to a Council of Churches meeting. I got a call from a guy whose name sounded vaguely familiar, but I don't think I'd met him yet. His name is Dave Lawless. You all know him now, and he couldn't make the council meeting, but could I take a resolution to support the push for affordable housing, for an affordable housing trust fund, and so, I guess we were sort of on the ground floor, kind of indirectly. And then I think most people in the room know Bill Embry was the driving force, along with Charlie Lantner
Driving force.
on the Lexington. But driving out through horse country and looking at all those modestly priced homes, is there within the Affordable Housing Trust Funds a provision for a kind of an endowment kind of fund that would, because there's a lot of money sitting out there, and I'm not sure how you get those folks involved, but because
I am not as familiar with the ordinance governing the Lexington Affordable Housing Trust Fund as I am with Kentucky Revised Statute that authorizes the State Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So I don't know, but honestly, even if it's not, I feel like it could be pretty easily amended. And I will say that is what the General Assembly, in their infinite wisdom, has started doing, that I agree with, over the past few years. So one of our legislative victories that didn't directly impact Lexington, which is why I didn't mention it, but since you gave me this opening, the legislature did create a rural housing trust fund, with its first priorities to address the housing gaps in the tornado regions and floods. Yeah. And this is the first time that the Kentucky General Fund has ever been used for housing, ever, like in our history of the Commonwealth. Because if you look at who represents us in the General Assembly, housing is it's worked out pretty well for them. So they just haven't had to think about it until, these disasters came to the front door. The way they structured it was they moved money they had already appropriated, but then also left open the door to receive charitable contributions, such as that from an endowment. So that it can receive private money as well. I don't see why Lexington couldn't do the same. And Dave Lawless, we used to call him the godfather of Appalachian housing because of his role at Fahey, and he was one of the first people that I looked up to when I lived in Hazard, and he was actually one of the founding members of HHCK. So he has done so much good in the state. Big fan over here.
I don't pretend to understand this, but this hopefully I think can shed some light on the reading that I did within a week or so. The Herald put out something around, as I understood it, the issue really is around what developers do and what they're required to do in terms of house building, and percentages of that have to go to affordable housing. Is that right? Do I understand that right?
Potentially, yes. Potentially, you are correct. So one of the tricky things with subsidized affordable housing, subsidized development, is so at the federal level, one program that we did not touch on, it's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, and it comes from the Department of Treasury. Each state gets a certain amount of what they call tax credits, and that it has to go through a qualified allocation plan, and then different projects compete for these projects. The Treasury guidelines say that you only have to income limit it or restrict it to 80% or below of area median income. Which, again, those are honestly, those are your folks that are considered like lower middle class. And so what ends up happening is developers, in order to make a project work for that 0 to 30% income range, have to come up with other sources of subsidy. And that's where Lexington's been real successful. And I think advocates and tenants and people who are impacted want them to become even more successful in terms of layering that subsidy so that they can serve that 0 to 30%, because I think that has been the criticism of affordable housing development is it truly affordable? Again, to those extremely low income neighbors. And having run rental property myself, not using the tax credit program, using home investment partnerships program, like it is hard. It is hard to, I'm not saying, this is not my pitch of like, please feel sorry for the poor developers. I promise I'm not married to one. But, and I will say, if they are truly like mission minded, community minded, it can be really like the amount of subsidy that is required on an ongoing basis. If your rents are going to be low enough for the people who really need them to afford them, like it's just going to require some ongoing subsidy and some deep subsidy on the outset. And people don't want to hear that. Elected officials don't want to hear that, you know? So
The legislation.
I mean, I wouldn't mind it. They need to come from somewhere. But yeah, I think just a recognition, like I think the Lexington, I think Rick McQuady, and full disclosure, he was on my board for years. And I knew him when he was at Kentucky Housing Corporation. I think he really did try to stretch it as far as he could, making the numbers work. But also bottom line is he's a CPA and he's super conservative, like numbers wise, you know?
He escaped to Florida.
Yeah.
That's I started to say Rick escaped because we used to meet with him and he escaped to Florida.
Yeah. Well, his wife called, she was like, you just have to come. She was like, I'm not going back there. You have to like actually start staying here. So it's tricky. As an advocate, I'm always going to advocate for housing for that 0 to 30%. Those are that I think if we could solve that, and honestly, by solving it, we just need to rethink investment, subsidy. They need to not become 4-letter words. We just need to recognize, like, or we can keep doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And we will just have unsheltered people cycling in and out of jails and shelters and hospitals, and we will pay for it that way. Or we could just be honest about it up front.
I'm thinking about last week's topic with taxes.
Yeah, with Natalie.
And this week's, and kind of see an overlap maybe with, in the sense of if we're not going to have an income tax, if we're going to think about sales tax and property tax. So, you know, that what is going to be important, it's going to be the property values, right? Instead of low income.
And that will, the logical place for that thought experiment to go is that we will continue to place even more value in trying to increase our homes' values and look at it as only our nest egg, or we're gonna try to figure out how to like get out of paying property taxes like they do in Texas. But like, I can see, you know, and I think I know where you're going with that.
Why would government want to have housing that does not have a lot of property tax?
Right. Because
if that's what we're funding everything on instead of income tax.
Right. That is another piece of it, because even with the first piece of legislation that started us down this road to zero income tax, House Bill 8, the low-income housing tax credit developments that we do have in Kentucky, because that program was actually created during the Reagan administration in '86 as part of that tax reform. So we do have a significant portfolio in Kentucky now after 40 years almost. And they got hit, like they were just like BlackRock or Blackstone or whatever. And so then they were like, hey, like, and so the legislature had to go back and fix it. But you're right, if we have more affordable housing developments that are subject to this alternative property tax valuation system as they are now, thanks to this past legislative session, woof. But on the other hand, the amount of money that could come from the federal government and state government, like our housing needs are, like I have to remember, like I cannot solve everything with just like the $2 million that the Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention gets, or even like the $3 million that was allocated to the Lexington Affordable Housing Trust Fund. There are changes that have to be made in the larger housing market as well.
Any other questions or comments?
Where do you have to drive back to?
Oh, just Frankfurt.
Okay.
I'm gonna drive past all of the extremely affordable housing developments on Frankfurt Pike. No, I'll take the interstate. It's dark out.
Anything from folks on Zoom? You want to ask a question or? Well, we can't say enough. Thank you for being here, taking your time, helping to digest all of this that gets up in my head and I get all whatever. That you help to digest it in a way that we can begin to understand it and hopefully do something with it. As I hear, he was talking about what letter to write and people were taking notes. And once we understand some of these concepts, I think it's easier to speak to that. And so we're glad just very glad that you came and were willing to speak. And
yes.
So.
Well, I appreciate it. I love talking to people and especially talking to different church groups. And I appreciate your willingness to host somebody from a neighboring county.
Yes.
Well, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If we have other questions or something comes up, I assume I can email you.
Yes, and that, like I said, I'll email that slide deck again, not because anybody wants to read a PowerPoint.
No, but it helps.
But like there might be some links that you may find helpful.
No, I appreciate that very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll get that out to folks.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Safe journey.
Thank you.